with a delay, but nonetheless, welcome to IMPAKT TV, a monthly online series of conversations with artists, researchers, and thinkers to discuss current issues in digital culture, media, and art. I am Daniela Tenenbaum, assistant curator at IMPAKT. Hosting with me today is Rosa Wevers, and we're very happy to be hosting Professor José van Dijck. Hello.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Professor van Dijck, I could introduce you for a while, but we'll keep it a bit short because you have a very impressive career. You are a professor of media and digital society at Utrecht University, where you focus on media, social media, and media technologies. And from 2015 to 2018, José van Dijck was the first female president of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. And in 2021, she received the Spinoza Prize, the highest academic award in the Netherlands from the National Science Council. Very happy to have you here.
Thank you. It's nice to be here and nice to be in conversation with you.
Yeah. We're also very excited to start this conversation. And I would like to start with a very general question that will bring us into your amazing work. What is your social media usage? Do you use social media?
Yeah, this is a very awkward question because I have written 3 books on social media, but I'm not a very big user myself. So I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on Instagram, I'm not on LinkedIn, I'm not on TikTok. I do have one vice, that's WhatsApp, because my family refuses to go to Signal with me. I use Signal as an alternative form of WhatsApp. I've recently tried out Mastodon, and we may talk about that a little later. I'm not very experienced in it. But my biggest means of communication is actually email. So I use a lot of email, and that is my preferred mode of communication. By the way, I read 6 newspapers per day online, so I do have a lot of news that I digest on a daily basis, but not through social media. And that is on purpose and by principle.
And you say, I have one vice. Why do you consider it to be a vice?
Well, because WhatsApp, of course, is owned by Facebook, and I would rather use Signal, which is a decentralized and not a not-for-profit social media platform. But a lot of people are on WhatsApp, and my family, as I said, refuses to go to Signal with me, so then you're stuck in the environment that you're not very happy with.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this answer. We want to dive into your book, The Platform Society from 2018 that you wrote together with Thomas Poel. Am I saying that name right?
Right. Thomas Poel and Martijn de Waal.
And Martijn de Waal, exactly.
They're my colleagues.
Which in this book you investigate how the platformization of modern society affects public values. I want maybe to start from the very big picture and then into the micro. So what does platformization mean, or how do you use this in the context of your book?
Right. It's quite a theoretical notion, platformization, but it means the act of becoming platforms. Basically, a lot of the daily activities offline that we're doing, like buying or selling goods, reading, communicating, whatever, are transformed into an online space. And that online space is increasingly ruled by the architecture that big tech corporations are designing for us. So they are in charge, they control the architecture of that space, that online space. And this new economy of platforms is fueled by data, the data flows that we constantly generate and that are feeding more or less into this platform machine, the platform ecosystem as I prefer to call it, and they're driven by algorithms. So what we do when we are in the platform society, as the title of my book is called, we're basically exchanging free online services in exchange for our data. That's the fuel that we're giving away, and attention. That is what we sell, basically our data and attention in exchange for the use of platforms, for being able to communicate, in a small group, in a large group, etc. And that is the kind of quid pro quo that we're sort of driven into. There's nothing we can choose for. We can't choose to not give away our data. in a specific sense, because you have to sign away your rights to, for instance, to control your own data. Once you sign onto the platform, that's it, and you can't really control, you know, the use of your data as far as the platform is concerned. So that is your consumer relation to, it's basically, I'm a consumer, but at the same time, I'm a producer of data. So in our platform ecosystem, I'm trying to work out, I've tried to elaborate on how the relation between the big platforms are, what tech companies do, how they control that ecosystem, how they are, we enable them basically to be in charge of our data and all the mechanisms that have to do with that. Well, that's the shortest introduction to a 250-page book.
Yes,
and then the book is called Platform
The Platform Society, right.
To also draw attention to the fact that this is no longer only a corporate enterprise.
Right, and no
very
longer
much has an impact on our society, right?
Absolutely. So we used to talk mostly about the platform economy as if it were just a commercial exchange of data for goods or data for services. But increasingly, our entire society, public and private sectors, have become dependent on that ecosystem, that infrastructure, online infrastructure that these tech companies have built in order to do whatever. Our schools, our universities, you know, they're almost completely dependent on that ecosystem that has been created for us by a commercial, corporately driven ecosystem that doesn't care much about public values or different types of democracies or various types of societal structures. They have basically their political economic infrastructure that they have built is offered to us, once again, in exchange for the fuel that we generate, the data, but that's what it is. And we have very little influence, very little impact, with a C, on how that corporate ecosystem is actually structured, how it's organized, and how it's ruled, how it's governed. So the whole governance of these platforms is a very important issue that we haven't really come to terms with. So a lot of public sectors, and that's why I'm so pertinent in using that word, of course, a corporate ecosystem has commercial values to seduce us into that system, right? Once we're there, we're sort of the prisoners of the white lines of that ecosystem.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, you know, let's say I'm sending my kids to school, right? And at school they're going on like whatever day trip they're going, and parents want to keep track of their kids and how they're doing. And the only possibility for parents to follow their children is through Facebook. Now, the school for me is a public space where we all, you know, we pay taxes to keep that public space going. And then in order to communicate with the parents, we have to move onto a private space which is commercially driven, which is based on advertising, you know, getting your attention. And that to me is incompatible with that public space that we want to protect. We don't want our kids to see advertising constantly. You know, that is something that we try to keep that public space really public. And that is how these two, the private sphere, the public sphere, or the corporate sphere and the public sectors are constantly intermingled. The more they make use of that ecosystem of platforms, the more they are drawn into the commercially driven platform ecosystem.
How, it sounds a bit dramatic, but how did we get to this situation? How did these platforms develop into using our data as a commodity?
Well, that's actually an interesting historical question. Let's say in the early 90s, when the World Wide Web was invented, or basically started in 1991, the web was still very friendly, very public, and people didn't realize that it would become such a global space in such a short time. So even in the, you know, Google only started in 1999, which is, you know, it's very, very young. Facebook started in 2004. YouTube started in 2006. By 2015, all these different, and there was a large variety of platforms in the beginning. I've actually written that the history of these platforms in another book in 2013, The Culture of Connectivity. But that history is fascinating because it's so short. By 2015, there were only like 5 big American corporations who sort of controlled that whole landscape. And by that time, and increasingly for the past 6 or 7 years, we have become increasingly dependent on the kind of platforms that they have designed for us to do all of our online communication. A lot of smaller companies that started out as non-profit, as non-commercial, as really sort of alternative inventions, they've been gobbled up by the big tech companies. They have bought up smaller companies at an exorbitant rate, and that has really created a sort of not an oligopoly. I can never pronounce that word because it's like we have basically five companies who control that ecosystem, not one, which is a monopoly, a duopoly. But in a lot of these markets, like there's a whole stack of platform services that is stapled on top of each other. And now those big five companies control more or less all of these, the whole stack, all the way down to the data centers, which is the very physical infrastructure on which that whole system is built. And even as far as the cables under the sea, they're owned by Facebook and Google, the satellites up in the air that are, you probably know Elon Musk owns a couple of these satellites, but Google does, Amazon does. And even, the whole hardware infrastructure, there are not many companies who build that hardware anymore, and they're completely almost controlled by the stapling, on top of each other, the stacking, more or less, of these different services.
You're talking about control, and we see that these companies have gained an immense amount of power in a really short time.
Right.
Do you think that this rapid growth has also had an impact on sometimes also the impossibility or incapability of governments to respond to that?
Absolutely. Governments have sort of lagged behind in terms of the regulation, the legal interventions that they wanted to pose to prevent those corporations from becoming so big. If you think about how the big corporations now are, well, they have become so big because governments haven't been able to keep up with their technological innovations and their growth, basically, and particularly because this is a global phenomenon. Governments always operate at the national level, and there's only, there's a big government like the Americans, you have the Chinese government, well, I usually explain this as two ecosystems, the Chinese ecosystem and the American ecosystem, but we have the European, as Europe, we don't have such an ecosystem, so we have become almost entirely dependent on mostly the American system, to some extent on the Chinese, TikTok, for instance. Yeah. But as Europe, as a continent, we don't have the same power in terms of, having that sort of company build an ecosystem for us. And at some point, and this has only been a history for 20 years, of course, very short, very, very brief, but we haven't been able to interfere or to sort of build an alternative stack in Europe. Because it went so fast, and it was like this, and then we were completely dependent on these two systems. Increasingly, though, for the past 5-6 years, I think the European Union, you were talking about regulation, European Union has been fantastically aware of how important it is to intervene and to actually set legal interventions into this process. So we have, since 2018, we have the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. We're now currently in the process of two major laws that are, I think, will go into, will become legal as of next year, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. The European Data Act is currently in the making, and I hope within a few years Europe will really have, kept up with that sort of legal framework that allows them to curb basically this monopolization of the platform ecosystem. On the other hand, it's not enough to just make a new legal framework and to curb this power legally. It's also important to have alternatives. And if you don't have alternatives, you have a very weak position to negotiate with global platform powers to actually, to change that system if you see that changes are necessary.
And we will discuss these alternatives later in our discussion. But before we do so, I want to discuss the second part of your research, which is the public values and how these are very much affected by the platformization of our society. First, I want to ask, which public values do you mean by that?
Yeah. There's a lot of public values, and there's a couple that we really, find important, like privacy. That is a very obvious one. You don't want to give away your data and lose all your privacy. Security, we want a secure online environment, and that is a very important public value. Accuracy, well, with all the misinformation, disinformation, and fake news going around, we have come to understand that accuracy is actually quite important. So those are very obvious public values, but then on top of that, we have public values that really pertain to society as a whole, like democratic control. How can we control the almost invisible data economies that are below the platform surface? So can we actually control what's happening there? Can we see what is happening? Often not, because the data flows and how they are, the mechanism by which they are, that dynamic is kept going, is a business secret. An algorithm is practically a business secret. So it's very hard to sort of keep democratic control on what happens below the surface of that ecosystem. So accountability is another public value. Whenever we, in our offline society, we know who is accountable, who is responsible for what particular part of our society. In the online world, that's sometimes very difficult to define who is responsible for an algorithm that runs a fool. Who is responsible in case that an algorithm turns out to be discriminatory because it's fed by the data, the historical data. And then if you feed an algorithm with discriminatory data, then of course what comes out is discrimination. You shouldn't be surprised by that, but who's accountable for that? So there are all these public values that we know that are very important, but they're not quite taken care of in that online corporate environment that we can hardly control. For one thing, we do that controlling mostly nationally, at the national level. So our Dutch government is responsible for regulation. The European Union is responsible at the European level. Mm-hmm. But this is a global phenomenon. Yeah. And if you have like a social media platform or network that works in 62 countries, you basically have 62 legislations that you need to deal with.
So even though these companies provide platforms that almost have like a public function, right? If it's like online education, they have different values, you say. It's
right.
More...
Well, of course, they're businesses, they're corporations. Yeah. Corporations are in there for commercial value. But like take Facebook, who has become so big, it now has 3 billion users, almost 3 billion in the entire world. That is quite a responsibility. Now, can you be responsible for the public values or the control over these values from people from 200 and something nations for 3 billion people in the world? That is quite something. So only recently these companies have become to realize that if things go wrong, like if there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech online, that is prohibited by law. The German law, the Dutch law, it prohibits hate speech to, in a specific situations. You can be held liable. The thing is with platforms, and that's a very interesting historical phenomenon, they are very exceptional, and that's why platformization is such an important term. Platforms are very strange animals. They're very strange entities. They are regulated as an entity, and this is regulated in the 1996 Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act. I won't trouble you with the details. This is an American act, and it basically says platforms cannot be held liable for content that users put on the platform. Mm-hmm. That was, in a time when there weren't any global operating networks, when there was, no Facebook at all. That only came 10 years later. And so that law is still is still working, and we're currently trying to change that. But this sort of organized the whole gray area where platforms owners are not responsible for what happens online. Users can be held responsible, but hey, how can you find and fine 3 billion users in an online space, right? And so now we're stuck with this strange animal, this strange entity that is can hardly be regulated, but that we need different laws to actually tell us what platforms can do, what they do, and what they can be held liable for and responsible for. So these are all the new questions that have come up in the history of 20 years, 20 or 30 years that we've been working with these platforms. So it's an incredibly complex and dynamic history because so much has happened in the past 20 years. We haven't been able to keep up in terms of our legal frameworks with this specific type of lawmaking.
You said that we are stuck with these legislations, with these platforms. I want us to see an excerpt from Vlad Anioller's project, New Extractivism, and we will continue the conversation afterwards.
New Extractivism, an assemblage of concepts and allegories. The word assemblage is usually understood as a collection or gathering of things or people, a machine or object made of pieces fitted together, or a work of art made by grouping together found or unrelated objects. This map and accompanying footnotes are precisely that. One big messy assemblage of different concepts and ideas, assembled into one semi-coherent picture, or let us say a map, a worldview. 1. Gravity. Like Einstein's theory of relativity, massive objects curve the space and time of the topography of the internet, proportionally to their weight, defined by the number of their users and content. So we can think of massive monopolies and conglomerates such as Google and Facebook as enormous black holes that, with their gravity, create a field so intense that it attracts and swallows the content and users. 2. Forces. Many other potential vectors and social forces contribute to that gravitational force. The fear of social isolation, economic and professional insecurity, unrealistic expectations of efficiency and productivity in the adapt or die environment, tailored addictions, depression and anxieties. These are just some of the other vectors that constitute social forces that keep us, with or without our wish, attached to those platforms. The social cost of opting out has become so high that opting out is essentially a fantasy. 3. Black holes. Our imaginary hero is swimming against one of those platforms' gravitational force. As they glide towards the singularity defined by the mass of these giants, users and content pass beyond the event horizon, the imaginary boundary in time and space, beyond which there is no return to the outer part of this universe. The event horizon defines the line after which the social and economic price of leaving those platforms is becoming too high. No matter how fast they try to swim now, the stream will pull them towards the center of the black hole.
So as I said, this is an excerpt from Vlad Anioller's project, New Extractivism. Vlad Anioller also had a keynote at our latest Impact Festival, The Curse of Smooth Operations, which is now online. What is your general impression from this video?
I didn't see it before, so I was very, it was actually very nice to see it. It reminded me a lot of The Social Dilemma, which is a documentary that you may have seen on Netflix. A lot of my students know The Social Dilemma, they've watched it. And that actually the same 3 points are made in The Social Dilemma than in this documentary. The monopoly question, which I just talked about, the gravity of a handful of big tech companies that are, completely controlling that ecosystem. The addiction question is interesting, the second point that was mentioned here. We have this constant anxiety about keeping up with everything that happens online, and a lot of the mechanisms in social media are keeping us engaged. Engaged is sort of the neutral term for that, but basically it's like keeping you onto the screen and grab for your attention, because attention is really what's being bought and sold here. And that sort of addiction argument is, I think, often underestimated as an important force that drags you into that, what they call the black hole. You know, think about how many times you actually watch your phone and you check your messages. Even though I'm not on, I just explained, I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Twitter, etc. Still, I keep checking my email. Even that is sort of addictive. It's the whole idea of keeping up with something that you may have been missing out on. And that addiction argument is a very powerful dynamics that plays into dragging you into that attention hole. And the last point really reminded me of the rabbit hole that is explained in The Social Dilemma. It was first explained by a journalist in the New York Times as the YouTube rabbit hole, particularly in relation to hate speech and fake news. When you watch one video, two videos, maybe three on YouTube, if those are filled with a particular sentiment, like, you know, driving you towards a hate speech community, or not believing the facts of, you know, the corona pandemic, or that was a very interesting illustration there, you're very quickly, even within 20 other feeds that, you know, that you follow on YouTube, you're dragged into the, what he calls the rabbit hole. And that is it's actually not just a theory. It was, I'm not a psychologist, but it was actually researched by psychology experts who actually can prove that you're literally dragged into that by the algorithm, of course, who produces that sort of feed. So interestingly, I saw exactly the same mechanisms being explained here in this documentary than in the much more popular The Social Dilemma.
I think in the video we really see this figure trying to climb out, trying to hold on, and he's really, or that person
sort
is really
helpless.
not able to, helpless.
Right, yeah.
Do you see this dynamic also becoming more and more the case? Because I also have to think, for example, about TikTok.
Yeah.
I think if we talk about addiction, TikTok as an app is even much more proven to be much more addictive, and now other platforms are also imitating that. So you see that Instagram, for example, also works with these rules that try to keep you scrolling.
Yeah, you know, that whole scrolling addiction is a totally new phenomenon, and TikTok indeed makes very much use of these dynamics. That is particularly damaging because a lot of younger children are using TikTok, and there's very little control over how they use it. So this is a big issue right now. I always thought that I wasn't very addiction prone, but I realized how, you know, strong that urge is. Like, you have to check, you have to scroll. And I'm not into scrolling, but that is a very important feature. Addiction is not the consequence of features that have been built into social media platforms on purpose. It's not a bug, it's a feature, right? So this is not something that comes out of some, you know, mistake, or they accidentally, you know, put in this dynamic. No, it's a purposely driven, data-fed phenomenon, and this is built into the mechanisms that we're being fed. So, and this is, I think, the constant going back and forth between what should we regulate in terms of what is called engagement in a neutral term, but it's basically addiction-prone feeding machine. You know, this is the dynamics that are built in on purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were just in the conversation that we had before, I was just confessing that I how is it called? Doom scroll?
Doom scrolling.
Yeah, I'm for sure addicted. But I think what Vlad and Yoler is discussing is, or at least this is how I understood it, it goes beyond addiction, right? He talks about the social cost of opting out. Opting out is anyways a very big, it's not being on social media anymore, it's opting out. It's a very dramatic decision. Do you think we can go back? Do you think there is a way to opt out? Is there, well, you don't use so much of social media, but do you think we can?
And still I call myself addicted. I'm not even using this as a lot of platforms, I still call myself addicted. That's a very hard question, psychologically, but also sociologically. Because, you know, if I was just talking about schools, and I think that's a very pertinent example, because we, children have to be in school. They have no choice. They have to be there. And a lot of these mechanisms are sort of creeping into the daily fabric of their online activities. Like, they have to be online. They're going from, doing their school assignments and online, and they're sort of dragged into going to YouTube. Yeah. A lot of these mechanisms happen unknowingly or naively, or children just use it, go back and forth. And I think I'm not a psychologist, or let alone a child psychologist, but this addiction must build up very, very early for children to sort of adapt to this new age, and it becomes part of your attitude. It becomes part of your the way you behave. It becomes part of your social behavior, because if you're the only kid who's not on TikTok and your entire class is on TikTok and doing the greatest things and interacts, and that's all condoned, then it is very hard both for a teacher and for a parent to say, no, my 7-year-old is not allowed to go on TikTok.
Yeah, because basically what you used to have, like the school garden
right.
outside, the whole social sphere is now not only physical anymore, it's much more even online.
Right.
Sometimes
yeah.
I live close by a school, and I really see all the children in their breaks.
Right, they're watching the phone.
There. And that is their public
yeah.
or social sphere, so to say.
Yeah, there have been schools who have been trying to ban devices from, like mobile devices from the classroom. It turns out that not only the children complain, but the parents complain as well.
Yes.
Because, they cannot reach their children anymore in class. If they have to put their devices in, a locker before they go to the classroom. I read this one very interesting statistic in the New York Times. It's a few years ago, but do you know how many times parents and children these were high school children, between 14 and 17, are communicating online with their parents on an average school day?
How much?
Guess.
In numbers?
4 times.
In times?
4 times.
4 times? No, I say 30.
Well, it's in between, 17.
Oh.
17 times. So 17 times per day, they check whether their children are doing okay. Are you doing okay?
Wow.
Like, they have contact back and forth. Now, think about the consequences, not just in terms of addiction, but parents also internalize that sort of surveillance, controlling behavior that has come with the technology, right? Because this is, in fact, as Zuboff calls it, surveillance capitalism. And the surveillance factor of this, this whole platform ecosystem is part of that is controlling, having control over the one with whom you communicate.
Yeah, because I remember when I was in high school and I didn't have a nice grades, I would say, well, I would say, okay, so I have something to tell you. Everybody in class had a really low grade, and so I have like a 5, and so in general it's really not that bad. And I could give this context around it, right? But it also gave me a certain sense of responsibility, like do I solve the problem myself? What do I share with my parents or not? Now parents can just see it.
Not only that, but they can see it before the child or herself sees it, and that is this is a big issue for discussion in schools. And this is actually, I was just talking about public values. Public values are not, they're not like totally something that you can either have or have not. They're often negotiated in a context, like you weigh privacy against surveillance, or you weigh autonomy of a child against the interest of a parent to actually look into a student's grades. Now, this is a weighing of back and forth of, what are public values and how does that weigh into this decision? And so this is something a school needs to discuss. But oftentimes these systems come in as, built in. They're not negotiated. They're just implemented, and whoever works with them, that's how it works. So this is a very important issue. Discussion about values is always contextualized. So this should be an important issue to discuss between parents and teachers, between parents, children, and teachers.
Yeah, we are running out of time, sadly, and there are already a few questions. I would like us to go very quickly a bit more into the whole issue of social media. more specifically Twitter, which has been a hot topic, very buzzing topic of
in the past few weeks.
Exactly. Yeah, you just talked about Mastodon. Well, with the whole issues around Twitter right now after Elon Musk has purchased it, the way it's perhaps hopefully going down, and the rise...
Hopefully going down.
Well, it's just, Elon Musk. But yeah, and then we see this very interesting thing that is happening, which is the rise of a decentralized social media platform, which is Mastodon, that you mentioned that you very recently started experimenting with. Not yet. I understand that it's a very complicated social media platform to enter.
Yeah, it's very different.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, maybe first the question about Twitter, of course, it's an intrigue. What's happening now is really like it became a very, global scale microblogging platform, the most important that we have globally. And it was bought up by, Elon Musk, who managed to change the whole setup of Twitter within 2 weeks. And it's really, at this moment, as we speak, it is changing completely its governance, its moderation practices, the routines that they've built up, the technology, everything is changing in Twitter. And everyone is upset because, this is sort of disturbing. It's very disruptive. Twitter first disrupted the entire social media or the whole media landscape, and now Twitter itself is being disrupted and realizes how important it is that, how it is governed and how technology works.
But I did, well, as preparation for today's discussion, I did read a lot about this, and I do understand that people are upset over this change because Twitter started as the underdog.
Right.
The underdog social media platform, but also a social media for underdogs. And then having it being purchased by someone, by a billionaire, kind of, throws it around in a way that underdogs are not very happy with. But I want to talk about decentralized social media platforms and how they are perhaps new players in the social media ecosystem. I want to hear from you. I mean, you haven't used Mastodon that often yet, but
maybe we should first explain what a decentralized platform is, because vis-a-vis centralized platform, that is really what, the difference is that a centralized platform like Facebook or Twitter, all your data are owned and operated by in a central place, right? And that central place, like the owner of Twitter, the owner of Facebook, can do whatever it wants with that data. A decentralized, and also, by the way, very important, moderation is taking place centrally. Facebook has 35,000 moderators in place to moderate the discussions that are, global often. So decentralized networks, on the other hand, are little nodes that cannot be controlled from one central spot, not from the center of that network. I usually use a picture to visualize that, so I have now that picture in my mind. But from all these decentralized nodes, there's no controlling factor. And this is an interesting thing that is happening currently, is some, like Mastodon, are saying, well, you just have your own server and you manage your own server, and that is what is called decentralized. You could also imagine, and actually I'm currently working on a project that tries to elaborate on that principle, that decentralized means that there's not just people in control of a small community, but there's a small community network that also has an offline component, like an organization which coordinates that discussion. And so there's various forms of decentralized platforms. And sometimes I prefer to call those networked communities, because that are sort of offline communities that already exist and that already have habits of moderation, habits of responsibility sharing. And there's decentralized communities like Mastodon, who are just technological options that you fill with communities. So I'm currently, and this is really like, I've been thinking about this for the past few weeks, and it's very exciting that this whole landscape now, because of the Twitter demise and the Twitter downfall, is changing very rapidly. I don't know how long this will last. I can't predict it. Maybe Twitter is sort of reshaping itself very quickly and sort of gets its act together a very short time. I don't know. But if they don't, I think there's a very good chance that these decentralized networks are picking up steam and really start to think about what is it that we really want as people. Do we want communities to be empowered and reinforced by the technology, or do we want a technology provider that wants the communities to extract data from? And that is a really interesting question. Do we want to be consumers that are in that data extractivist model of centralized networks, or do we want to become more responsible communities who are in charge of our own data? More recently, you may have heard of Tim Berners-Lee, who was the inventor of the World Wide Web in 1991. He's now working on data pods, and sort of every individual may have his or her own data pod and decide for him or herself which data are going to be given away to hospitals, to researchers, and whether or not to commercial companies. So who is in control of giving away data? And that is the central question in terms of, do we have centralized or decentralized networks? So these are very exciting times for researchers like me, who are interested in how is this going to play out, in the short run, but very much in the long run. And what kind of community do we want online?
You mentioned moderation a lot. We, of course, recently saw in Twitter, I think there the moderation aspect of a centralized platform became very apparent when Twitter decided to ban Trump. Yeah. Now we have a new CEO or owner of Twitter, and now there was
after a week he reinstalled.
And he's reinstalled. What would this kind of moderation, or censorship even perhaps, mean in a more decentralized?
Well, I think one of the biggest deceptions of Twitter users over the past week, this just happened very recently, just 5 days ago, is that one person, an owner, can have sort of a bogus poll, has nothing to do with democratic systems, it's just a bogus poll, and says, well, he was banned before for, stupid reasons, let's just reinstall him. This is really weird. One person, I was talking about centralized platforms, at least at Facebook, they have a moderation. I just said they had 35,000 moderators, and they have a system of moderation. They had that at Twitter as well. Twitter was very, very experienced, basically, in moderating these discussions, applying to, to laws that are actually installed in that country and subjugating to the specific legal frameworks. Now, all of a sudden, Elon Musk comes in, throws it all up in the air, and he says, well, we just have a different system. And this, now I'm very, very curious to see, he fired, that half of the people who have this practice and this experience at Twitter. Yeah. So I'm very curious to see what happens next. I can't predict, but...
Well, I think here we very much see the danger of these commercial values.
Right. Elon Musk says it very explicitly, I want to have paid user fees. I want to get my advertisers back. Well, that is something that is really, a big issue right now, but so he's basically working on commercial mechanisms that he have to reshape basically Twitter, whereas the public values and community values that Twitter started out with, as you rightly pointed out, where are they? And are those users going to be so dissatisfied and discontented with what happens at Twitter that they're just leaving the network, starting their own? Are the old employees of Twitter, 7,000 or 4,000 who have been fired, are they going to start their own network? It's all possible. I can't predict, but it's a very exciting, intriguing problem.
For your analysis.
For my analysis, right. Yeah, you have to be a researcher to find this interesting, right.
And for your analysis, you have won the Spinoza Prize, and I think that also is a chance for you to not only theorize, but also work in an interdisciplinary way, perhaps putting because you mentioned the urgency of thinking about alternatives, of putting that criticism into practice, right?
Right.
Could you say a bit more?
Yeah, sure. It's very preliminary. We just started like 6 months ago, but we have put together a very small team. It's like 5 people, and we're working on a decentralized, non-profit, open source platform called PubHubs, Public Hubs, short for Public Hubs. And we're actually collaborating with public organizations like the public library, public broadcasting organizations, and patient organizations who want to have a community network, decentralized, open source, not being paid for in terms of your giving away your data, and particularly a safe, private, secure environment where they can interact on, a basis of trust. Now, how do you build trust into a system? That is the biggest issue that is currently on the table. This is very exciting. This is not like everyone asks me, are you going to build the next Facebook or the next Mastodon? No, we're actually doing field work. And this is an experiment where we hope by developing such a platform, a decentralized platform, to learn from those communities what they need and how we can provide the technology that fits their needs, rather than developing a technology and hoping that it will be sold. That's not our purpose. We want to work with communities to see what they need and what they can use. So it's a big experiment. Maybe it's complete failure. I don't care because, well, of course I care. I hope it will succeed. But if it doesn't, we learn a lot about what you should do. It's like, like working in a lab. This is our field lab. Yeah. Like, how does this work? So it's very exciting for a researcher to finally work on a project that provides an alternative rather than just simply criticize what we see. And I think the tech companies make great products. I'm a big fan of Google search. I think, by the way, I don't use Google search, I use DuckDuckGo, but I think it's a great product, but I think there should be alternatives. Yeah. If we don't have a diverse landscape of platform products, platform services, we become ourselves, it's like with an ecosystem in real life, in biology. If you have just 5 species and the rest, is sort of erased from the planet Earth, then you're not a very happy planet. And I really believe in sort of technological diversity, in platform diversity, as I call it. And the more, the merrier, because as long as we have space for all of these platforms to sort of interact, and that's why we need in legislation certain principles like interoperability, the condition that you can, for instance, use different platforms in this layered stack, or a principle like data portability, which is basically that I can carry my data, if I want to, from one service to another, from one platform to another. You can't now, if you have your data on Facebook, you can't go to Signal or to Mastodon. You can't carry your data, and that is why data portability is such an important principle.
So a way to take your data back.
Yeah, you have to think about who owns and controls your data, and those are very principled questions, very central to this whole problem.
What I'm really curious about is this new hub or
pop-ups.
Will there also be an addictive element, you think, or should that be something
very
to be
important.
completely erased?
Yeah, some of these organizations are actually, think of patient organizations, they're very aware of the addictive element. So we are talking to these communities and explaining or they're actually explaining to us what they don't want and how they do not want their online environment to work. And that is so interesting. We always listen to what is the commercial principle behind and the user convenience. That is a very, very important commercial factor. But let's listen to how we can build a secure and private environment for those people who have different needs and who don't want to be discriminated against because you're not like a specific user. Think about a lot of people who do not want to use a social platform at all, who just want to be less technology involved in their social interaction. There should be room for that, not having engagement as your first principle, and engagement means, of course, more data, more attention, more extraction.
Yeah.
I think we have time maybe for one audience question.
Sure, yes, one.
Somebody who is watching is asking if there are any politicians that you expect much from, or that you have high expectations from.
In the Netherlands?
Well,
is
in
this
Netherlands
a politician?
Or maybe in Europe. It's not a politician.
It's not a politician.
Okay.
When it comes to taking political action, proposed legislation, the Border Proof Agency.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, in the Netherlands, we now have finally a special Staatssecretaris, State Secretary Minister for digitization, for digital affairs. that I think is a big improvement. I have high hopes for, as I said before, for the European Union. I think the European Commission is currently very well on its way and one of the most progressive forces in defining what new legislation should look like. Margaretha Vestager is one of my heroes, one of my personal heroines. I think she made wonderful big steps in a big leap in enforcing existing legislation, but also building a new legal frameworks, and that I think we should really watch out for. And certainly in the Netherlands, we have great, civil society organizations. They're also political, but Bits of Freedom. We have Waag Society. We have a lot of civil society organizations who are very powerful in bringing this across. And therefore, we need that sort of empowerment, from bottom to top. And then people will come to realize that this is a very important issue. Laws can never work if they just work top down, but they also have to be fed by alternatives that are developed bottom up.
Yeah, we actually have a really interesting initiative here at Impact called Code. And it's all about reclaiming digital agency, and the goal is really to engage with artists or non-artists to create projects that really raise awareness to how our digital agency is being taken away from us.
Yeah.
And we do want to engage more in conversations with politicians, policymakers. So we are also from the bottom up.
I applaud that.
There are people taking us out of the black hole.
We're creeping out of that black hole,
exactly.
Right? To the surface.
Yes, more on that to come in the future.
Absolutely.
So with this we will wrap up our wonderful conversation that we had with you. Thank you very much, Professor
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And tune in for the next episode, which will be on the 7th of December with Latulbo Avedon. And it will be a conversation on being an artist in the metaverse.
And finally, if you want to hang out some more, check out the rooftop bar. There will be some discussion there, so you can meet other people who joined today's episode. Yeah. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.
Thank you.